Thank you, Jackie. Thanks to all of y'all for being here. You are great Americans and patriots for your having this interest in this project. I'm involved, and we are all involved, in a nationwide movement designed to rein in our runaway federal government and to restore checks and balances that have been lost in our federal system. Now, let me ask this question. How many of you are familiar with what's known as an Article 5 Convention of States? Raise your hands. Okay. So a little bit more than half of you are familiar with it. Let me give you a little bit of a history lesson about Article 5 to the Constitution of the United States. Back in 1787 at the Philadelphia Convention, when our founding fathers came together, there were many different interests they had balanced. There was the issue of North versus South in slavery. There was the issue of large states versus small states. And there was the issue of some states that wanted a strong federal government and some that were very protective of state rights. And so all of these interests they had to balance at the 1787 convention. And they came up with a federal government. But they didn't know if the federal government they were creating would be perhaps too strong or perhaps too weak. And they really couldn't agree on what it was because they didn't know. This was an experiment. And so they put a provision in the Constitution, in Article 5, for amending the Constitution. And the concept behind it was that if the government was too strong, it could be cut back. But more importantly, they thought if it was too weak, as existed under the Articles of Confederation, amendments could be proposed to refine it and make it better. And so there's a provision that we all know for amending the Constitution whereby 2/3 of each House of Congress can propose a specific amendment to the Constitution, and then that is referred out to the states, and if 3/4 of the states ratify that amendment, it becomes law. And 27 times that has happened in our Constitution and in our nation's history. But 2 days before that convention was going to approve and sign off on the final Constitution, there was a delegate, they called them commissioners back then, from Virginia by the name of George Mason, a name you've probably heard in history from time to time. And George Mason was absolutely convinced that this government that they had created was going to very quickly go beyond the powers delegated to it in this Constitution and seize more powers. He was convinced that it would very quickly intrude on the sovereignty of the states and that within a fairly short period of time it would be invading the freedoms and liberties of the citizens of the country. Does that sound familiar to any of y'all? He was convinced it would happen in his lifetime. And so 2 days before the convention was scheduled to ratify the Constitution, he objected and said there has to be a provision in the Constitution that allows that when this federal government becomes oppressive, it gives the states a mechanism to rein in the federal government independent of Congress. Because, as he argued correctly, Congress will never propose an amendment to the Constitution that reins in or cuts back on its federal power. And so there was another delegate by the name of Gouverneur Morris from Pennsylvania. And he, along with Elbridge Gerry, a delegate from Massachusetts, proposed to add a provision to Article 5 of the Constitution. And the provision that they added is the one whereby if 2/3 of the states submit applications to Congress asking Congress to call a convention of states, then Congress must call a convention of states. And delegates will get together from all 50 states and they can discuss and propose amendments to the Constitution that are consistent with whatever those within the scope of the call of those applications from those different states of Congress. And so that is what's known as the Article 5 convention process. Interesting thing about this Article 5 convention process It is not a mechanism for the states to bypass Congress when we have a runaway federal government. It is the mechanism that our founders put in the Constitution specifically for the purpose of allowing the states the opportunity to meet proposed amendments and try to rein in a runaway federal government. Now, the Convention of States project that Jackie mentioned and that I'm involved in and that we're going to be asking all of you to get involved in is a project whereby we are going to be organizing in all 50 states. The project was announced in August of this year, 2013. And already we're organized in almost or maybe slightly more than 40 states. And what we're doing is we're going to be lobbying the state legislatures to pass a resolution calling for an Article 5 convention. The purpose of which to be generally stated, is to rein in power of the federal government. The COS Project is a movement that's led by a gentleman by the name of Dr. Michael Ferris. Dr. Ferris is the founder of Patrick Henry College in Virginia and the chancellor of that college. That college is a conservative educational institution. Its goal is to produce conservative future leaders for this country. He is the founder of the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. He is a constitutional scholar, and he's one of the few attorneys that has ever actually litigated Article 5 in front of the United States Supreme Court. The COS Project is supported by Citizens for Self-Governance. That's a conservative think tank headed by Mark Meckler, and he is one of the founders of the Tea Party Patriots National. As I said, it was launched in August of 2013, and we've got state leadership teams set up in somewhere close to 40 states. Now, I mentioned we're going to be lobbying the state legislatures to pass a resolution for a convention. Let me talk a little bit about what that resolution says. It's asking for a Article 5 convention to be called for three purposes. The first purpose is to impose fiscal restraint on the federal government. Now, to most people, that means a balanced budget amendment. More than 70% in the polling today of the people want a balanced budget amendment. And there's actually a group out there called the Balanced Budget Amendment Task Force, which has already gotten resolutions for Article 5 convention passed in a number of states, depending on your count, somewhere between 18 and 20, to call a convention solely to propose a balanced budget amendment. The Convention of States Project resolution goes a little bit beyond that because of the concern that if we pass a balanced budget amendment and only that, what's going to happen? Well, to balance the budget, Congress will have to do one of two things. They will either have to attack and do something with entitlements, and we all know they're not going to do that, or they're going to have to increase taxes. And so what would effectively be a good amendment could have a very unfortunate and unhappy result, and that would be a large tax increase. So the Convention of States Project goes further when it says impose fiscal restraint on Congress. It would allow this convention to go further and to perhaps propose amendments that would include tax reform in it, limitations on Congress's ability to raise taxes, possible limitations on the rate of taxation. And there's been a host of other proposals made that I won't go into today about how we can require Congress to essentially do its duty of passing a balanced budget. 49 of the 50 states already have to have balanced budgets, and as we all know, it's time for Congress to do the same. The second item that is promoted under the COS term limit is another item that more than 50%, the last poll I saw was over 60% of the country supports, and that's term limits, and specifically term limits on federal officials. That would include Congress. But it could also include future Supreme Court appointees and federal court judges in general in the future. So that is the kind of thing, you may have feelings one way or the other about that, but it is the kind of thing that the 50 states could come together and talk about and decide, is term limits a good thing? And if it is, what's the best way to do it? There's no automatic proposal out there for it. And then the third item covered under the Convention of States resolution is one that we generally refer to as to restrain and limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. On its face, that may seem somewhat broad, but what it really is just a restatement and reaffirmation of 10th Amendment principles, that the powers that Congress have are the limited powers delegated to it under the Constitution. But what are some of the things that that particular aspect of the resolution could promote that we know to be fairly popular and would likely get the kind of supermajority of support that we would want in order to get 38 states to ratify it? Well, one thing is the equal application of laws to Congress as they make them apply to us. That seems to be universally supported. How about an end for folks like yourself that have to deal with county budgets? How about an end to unfunded mandates? Or requirement, like all the state legislatures, or most of them have, for single-issue legislation. What does that mean? It means that you don't have legislation that has a bunch of earmarks tied into it, and the kind of earmarks that we have going on now. Another possibility, you've heard a lot of people support the repeal of the 17th Amendment, which is the popular election of senators. I personally don't support the repeal of the 17th Amendment. But what I would like to see happen is possibly discussion over amendment whereby the states themselves could decide how their senators are chosen. It doesn't have to be uniform. Those two senators were intended under the Constitution to be there to represent the state legislatures. So if some states want to have popular election, that's fine. There may be state legislatures, however, who want to go back to the original process, which is appointment by those. So let's give them the option. As Jackie indicated, many of these proposals come within the scope of and are germane to the same Liberty Amendment proposal set forth in Mark Levin's recent book, The Liberty Amendments. The COS Project, you're going to be hearing more and more and more about it as it is gaining more and more momentum. It is something that many of the conservative commentators in this country have caught on to and support. But it also does have support from the left as well, and I can name some of those folks if you want it. But the project has been endorsed so far by Mark Levin, Rush Limbaugh, Glenn Beck, Mike Huckabee, Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, and Senator Tom Coburn of Oklahoma. So today we're asking you to join with us in working together to lobby, in this case, our legislature at the state of Georgia, to help us lobby them to pass the CO resolution in the upcoming legislative session in 2015. And here's how you can do that. You can go to the Convention of States website, conventionofstates.com, and hit the tab that says Action Center. What action can you take? And we've got a tab that says Action Center. When you hit that, you'll have some options that come up. One of them is a tab for leadership. If you would like to be a leader, if you would like to become a district captain in this effort, there's a tab there that you can hit for leadership, for district captains. It gives you a job description of that. You can put in your name and your email and a little bit of information about yourself, and we'll be in touch with you to talk about that. There is a second tab that if that might be too much time and you can't take that you can look at. It's called the Volunteer tab. And we need volunteers of all kinds. We need people to send emails, to send letters, to make phone calls, to show up at the Capitol, to go to campaign events from time to time to support the people who support, the legislators who support the COS project. So, that is what we're here today to ask you to do. And with that presentation, let me open the floor to any questions you may have about Article 5 and the Convention of States project.